All right, everybody. So welcome. This is carbon sequestration on Delmarva. This is Eastern Shore Land Conservancy's second workshop in a four-part series titled Solutions for Changing Delmarva. My name is Darius Johnson. I'm Eastern Shore Land Conservancy's communications manager. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us for this workshop and for being a part of this series. We're really grateful for the participation that we've had thus far and that we have tonight. So I just want to say that we have an informative evening planned tonight. We have some really engaging speakers. It's also late, so I don't really want to waste too much time. I want to just allow us to jump right into it. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to just give some quick housekeeping updates. So for all the attendees, this is a view-only webinar. So really the only way that you can engage with us, the panelists, is by using the chat feature through Zoom webinar. But also if you have any questions, we really encourage you to use the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout each presentation. And in the Q&A portions after each presentation, we'll make sure that those questions get posed back to the corresponding presenter so we can address anything that comes up on your mind throughout each of the sections. So this is the agenda that we have for tonight. As I mentioned, it's going to be really informative. It's going to be really engaging and really excited for it. So on this note, I want to introduce Jim Bass, Eastern Shore Land Conservancy's not communications manager, that's me, Coastal Resilience Program Manager. And he's going to share a little bit about this workshop and its purpose and what it means for the entire series.
Thank you, Darius. And thanks again to all of you for attending this evening's workshop. As we discussed in our first workshop 3 weeks ago, the Delmarva Peninsula is in jeopardy because of threats associated with climate change. Sea levels are rising, precipitation patterns are shifting, and temperatures are increasing. All of these hazards tie back to a common cause, which is the emission of greenhouse gases. So tonight we're going to hear from 3 experts, all of whom have special ties to Kent County, Maryland, about ways we can reduce the level of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere and even make money doing it. When I did a technology check with our 3 speakers last Friday, a quick housekeeping exercise turned into almost an hour's worth of discussion about each other's work, lamenting challenges to combating climate change, and brainstorming ideas for future carbon-related solutions. The energy and enthusiasm that these 3 have is incredible, and honestly, it made me so excited for tonight's workshop. In addition to thanking each of you and all of our speakers, I do want to recognize our sponsors at the Roush Foundation. Without their generous support, none of this would be possible. So a special thank you to Phil Roush, Kathy Brill, and the rest of the team. Without any further ado, Darius, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Jim. So as I mentioned, we have some 3 exciting, really engaging speakers tonight. We have Laura Lengnick, founder and principal at Cultivating Resilience, Sally DeLeon, senior project manager for University of Maryland's Office of Sustainability, and Trey Hill, CEO of Harborview Farms. So Laura, she's going to be first up tonight. Laura, please turn your camera on as I introduce you to everybody. All right. So Laura Lengnick is an award-winning soil scientist who has explored agricultural sustainability for almost 30 years as a researcher, policymaker, educator, activist, and farmer. Over the last decade, Laura has led federal, state, and regional projects exploring ecosystems-based agricultural climate solutions that cultivate healthy land, people, and community. Laura is founder and principal at Cultivating Resilience, LLC, an Asheville, North Carolina-based consulting firm that works with organizations of all kinds to integrate climate risk management and resilience thinking in the operations and strategic planning. Thank you so much for being here, Laura. With that note, I'll take it to you.
All right, thanks, Darius. I am so excited to be here tonight. And I'm trying to talk while I'm doing things, and I'm not very good at that. So let's see, yes, I want to take hold of the screen. So let's see. All right. As I was saying, I'm so excited to be here tonight because this evening is really a home for me. I spent probably 15 years of the early part of my career in the Maryland area. I worked at the USDA Beltsville Agriculture Research Center. I was an undergraduate at University of Maryland College Park, and I spent lots of years on the northern part of the Eastern Shore up around Chestertown. So it was really a pleasure for me to be invited to come speak with y'all tonight. So I want to frame my presentation this evening with this idea, this question. It's on everyone's mind. It's been asked in many different ways. And as a soil scientist, of course, I was thrilled when about 5 years or so ago, soil became the climate solution. And so this is just one example of the way that this enthusiasm and this excitement about the potential for biological sequestration, and in particular soil sequestration as a mitigation option to help it as an important solution to climate change. But as this discussion moved on, it started to concern me that there was so much focus on soil sequestration. And the reason it concerned me is because agriculture actually can do a whole lot more than just sequester carbon in soils. There are at least 3 important ways that agriculture can help to mitigate greenhouse gas pollution. The first is to change practices so that we avoid creating emissions in the first place, or we reduce emissions when we must produce them. And we can do this with methane and with nitrous oxide emissions through reducing fertilizer manure, through changing fertilizer, manure, and feed management practices. And CO2 emissions can be reduced by adopting fuel efficient practices. And so first at the first instance, we can look at how we can reduce emissions in agriculture. We can also substitute fossil fuel in agriculture and produce on-farm energy as a second way to mitigate greenhouse gas pollution. We can do this through on-farm production of energy and also use solar, wind, and biofuels as alternatives to fossil fuel. And then the third way is biological solution. And biological sequestration. And this is CO2 removed from the atmosphere and stored in plants and soils. So when you look at this bigger picture, you can see that soils, while they're an important piece, they're just one part of that whole picture. But there's been an explosion of ideas bubbling up, different solutions bubbling up about how agriculture can be the solution to climate change. Over the last 5 years or so, we've seen just a proliferation of different and supposedly new kinds of agriculture: climate smart agriculture, carbon farming, veganic, carbon neutral agriculture. That's just the first column there. Restoration agriculture, sustainable agriculture, regenerative, certified organic, agroecology, climate smart farming, regenerative agriculture, climate neutral, resilient agriculture, and conservation agriculture. I am really encouraged by all of this interest and all of the new interest in agriculture. And I see this these new names that are being invented, or old names that are being brought back and repurposed for climate solutions. This is all really an excellent development, because we're seeing and we're beginning to understand and embrace that there really are some very significant agriculture climate solutions out there. The other good news, which you don't hear about quite so much from any one particular type of agriculture when someone's promoting it, but it's really good news as well, is that it turns out that no matter what you call it, all of these climate solution agricultures are using a very small group of agricultural practices that have been developed most recently by sustainable farmers and ranchers. And that's really good news, because that means that every farmer, no matter their farming philosophy, can begin to adopt some of these climate solution practices. So I want to just talk a little bit about this small set of practices that are climate solution practices that all these different farming ways of farming, new ways of farming, are using. And so this is a group of practices that are known as high mitigation practices. In fact, they were identified nearly 20 years ago by USDA as practices that could mitigate greenhouse gases and also provide many co-benefits, both to the farm and also to communities nearby the farm. These practices include conservation tillage, which is just using less tillage, disturbing the soil less when you do have to till, or using no-till. Nutrient management practices, these are practices like making sure that you're putting the right fertilizer that you need in the right place at the right time. The third high mitigation practices is a whole group of using organic amendments and cover crops. And then there's diversified production systems. And these are cropping systems or crop and livestock systems where you're mixing different species of crops and mixing in livestock into those crops. So much more than just perhaps a two crop rotation such as corn and soybeans, but you're doing a lot more, much more diverse mixtures of crops and livestock. Intensive grazing is describing many different kinds of practices that involve moving the livestock around on the landscape. Agroforestry, at its most simple, it's essentially putting trees in areas or putting annual crops and livestock into forests. And then finally, farmscaping is really taking a step back and looking at the whole farm landscape and working with the different parts of the landscape to take advantage of different ecosystems that are on that landscape. So that was a real fast walk through these high mitigation practices. And what you can see on the right-hand side is a little bit of summary of some research that shows the mitigation potential of these sustainable agriculture practices. So if you're able to reduce fertilizer use by adding nitrogen-fixing cover crops to your rotation, you can reduce CO2 emissions by up to 50%. You also, there's 50% less energy use in pasture-based versus feedlot beef production. There's about 50% greater soil carbon storage in organic versus conventional farming. And don't yet let that comparison of organic and conventional trip you up. Really, organic farmers are just using many of these sustainable practices. And this comparison is more to conventional farming, not diversified farming. So conventional farmers that are not using these practices. And then the last comparison was that it takes about 25% less energy use in organic versus conventional farming. So there really are a lot of benefits to these particular practices, and that's why all these new climate solution agricultures are using them. So I want to get back to my question at the start of the presentation. Can dirt save the earth? Now remember, I'm a soil scientist. I have been working in soils. I fell in love with soils in college, and I've enjoyed working with soils my whole career. I really want the answer to be yes to this question, but let's do a little bit of math. So currently, the CO2 concentration in the carbon concentration in the atmosphere is about 400 or so parts per million carbon. The target level for about 2 degrees Celsius warming is 350 parts per million. So we basically need to reduce the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere in order to get to that target level, kind of safe climate change, manageable climate change. we need to reduce it from 408 to 350 parts per million. So we have to remove about 10 tons of carbon to get about a 5 part per million carbon reduction in the atmosphere. So 10 billion tons for about a 5 part per million carbon reduction. So what this means is to reach that target, 350 parts per million, we need to do two things. We need to first zero net emissions. So basically, we can't put any more excess carbon in the atmosphere. And then we need to draw down 200 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So can dirt save the earth? What is agriculture's contribution? There have been many global estimates in the last 10 years or so on agriculture's contribution, and I've shared some of these on in the table on the right, which you can take a look at. But global estimates all come in, no matter who's estimating them, at around 1 billion tons of carbon per year. And you can see if you look at that table, you've got the different scenarios, so there are different estimates in that first column, global annual rate of sequestration. And this is agriculture. This is not just soils. This is soils and plants. And then lifetime impact and so on. These are studies that were collected and described in the Carbon Farming Solution, a 2015 book. So pretty much all these estimates come in at around 1 billion tons per year, and that's at a cost of $100 a ton per carbon. The cost part of this only matters because the cost of carbon right now is running between $5 and $10 a ton, not $100 a ton. And we get more sequestration, more chance at mitigation if the economics are better. So if we pay more, if the price of carbon is higher, then there's more chance that more people are going to be willing to adopt these practices to mitigate. Okay, so global estimates are around 1 billion. And then there was a pretty interesting study done 4 years ago or so looking at USDA conservation programs over the last 30 years. And they estimated that these programs in total, remember conservation practices, conservation farming was one of those kinds of climate solution agricultures. And they estimated that over the whole life of those programs, these conservation programs were able to reduce U.S. ag emissions by about 0.6 billion tons at a cost of between $400 and $1,000 per ton of carbon. So I think if you take a look at these kinds of estimates, it's pretty clear that dirt cannot save the earth. There's actually really no silver bullet out there. We create greenhouse gases all through the different sectors in our economy. And the way that I like to think about it is that there's really no one silver bullet. We all have to think about the kinds of changes that we can make in order to reduce emissions and also sequester emissions. And as you can see, if you look, this is 2018 EPA data in the different sectors and their contribution to greenhouse gases. Agriculture is really relatively small amount of the overall greenhouse gases that are produced in the country. So rather than thinking that farmers are going to save the world, farmers are going to do this for us, we really need to think about how we can the kinds of changes we can all make to make this happen. And the good news is that we've got lots of good resources. Folks have really been doing a lot of work smart work, very data-driven and science-based work to figure out what are the most efficient ways for us to begin this work of drawing down the carbon from the atmosphere. This is results from a group called Project Drawdown. and it shows you its ranking, and this is in terms of cost effectiveness of the action, ranking the top. It ranks the top 100 actions that we can take. And what I've shown you here is the top 20 actions. And what I really want you to notice is that 10 of the top 20 actions, the most effective, most cost-effective actions that we can take to draw down the carbon from the atmosphere, are all related to food or land use. So that's, if you don't remember anything else from what I've said tonight, I want you to remember that there really is a lot of potential. There's an enormous potential for climate solution in agriculture and in land use, but it's not just soil sequestration. It's a broader focus on how we use land, how we manage land, and then really important, notice the third and fourth top option has got to do with how we eat. So again, we all have a role to play in developing climate solutions. So this just puts a different look, a different picture to help you start thinking about how we might change the way we use land, how we manage land in order to achieve these top 10 most effective climate sequestration and climate solution actions. This is just a picture that puts it all together. If you look from the left to the right, what you see is that we've got land use that's more wildlands or natural lands. In the middle, we've got land use that's more human managed lands, and then at the right, we've got more urban, suburban, and urban lands. And again, the message in this image is that there are lots of changes that need to be made all through our economy, and so we all have a role to play in them. So we've got a good idea. There's very good evidence that changing the way we eat and changing land management is an important step forward to managing mitigation as a part of the climate change solution. But there's also another tool, another resource that we have, and that's a sustainable development concept that is being researched right now in many parts of the world. It's called the city region concept. And it's this idea that we can manage a whole region, the cities, and then the rural, the suburban, peri-urban, and rural areas around them. And we can manage them in ways that are going to benefit not just climate change, but also more generally the well-being and health of land, people, and community. So there's a international program developing these ideas, and there's research going on in many of the world's largest metropolitan areas. They're developing assessment tools, research methods, and also developing planning ideas and policies to improve, to take advantage of, and to use the fact that we have these mosaics of land uses around major cities that we could use to actually promote climate solutions and also increase the resilience of cities. So when I first learned about the city region idea, this concept, I was really interested to see if I could see any patterns of those kinds of changes going on in the US. And I was particularly interested to see how sustainable agriculture and food systems might be helping to cultivate these land use and changes in how we eat kinds of climate solutions. And so about a decade ago, I did a national case study project where I talked with farmers and ranchers across the country and asked them questions to try to get into a little more depth of what it means to create climate solutions or cultivate climate solutions in agriculture and food. And I just want to finish up tonight with just a little bit of a glimpse of the kinds of stories that I found in this project that I think really offer some great ideas for the Oasis, the Delmarva Oasis idea. So I talked with farmers like Gabe Brown, who ranches, farms and ranches out in Bismarck, North Dakota. He's got 5,000 acres. He's growing a very diverse food grain production systems, and also has restored native prairie and produces prairie finished beef. Jim Cohen in Flushing, Michigan, has an organic fruit silvopasture. So that means he's putting livestock in his fruit orchards. He's producing apple finished pork and also hard cider on his farm. Jonathan Bishop, Bishop's Orchards in Connecticut, has a very diversified fruit and vegetable farm. He has an on-farm pick-your-own business, also a bakery and a winery, which is using the products that he grows on the farm. And he also has a supermarket as well, which is also selling products from other farmers in the area. Tom Trantham has Happy Cow Creamery in South Carolina. He produces finished milk. He has an on-farm creamery and also a farm store. So again, these are just real quick glimpses at what is possible when you begin to diversify agriculture and when the farms reach into the food system as well. I want to share just a few other examples of more regional efforts that are looking at how we can use the city region idea and combine it with climate solution agriculture to create something really powerful. These are just a few examples. Shepherd's Grain is a regional producer, cooperative, distributor of grains in the Pacific Northwest. Hickory Nut Gap Meats is a regional distributor of grass-based, grass-finished meats in the Southeast. Co-op Partners Warehouse is a food distributor that's a cooperative in the Midwest. The New England Food Vision is just one example of the many regional food system planning projects and assessment projects that are going on in the U.S. Maine Harvest Federal Credit Union is the very first. It opened last year, the very first credit union in the U.S. that specializes in investing in regional food businesses. And then the final example there is Carbon Harvest. That's a project that I'm involved in. It's here in the Southern Appalachians, and we are developing a farmer-owned cooperative edible forestry carbon market. I also see a lot of hope in a new policy that was a new act that was introduced last year in the House, the U.S. House. This is a federal policy by Shelley Pingree in Maine, and it is going to be reintroduced this year. It's the Agricultural Resilience Act. How this relates to city regions and climate solution agriculture, probably you can get an idea from looking at the different elements of the act, but it's basically the smartest climate resilience legislation that we're seeing. It sets out programs to be funded through the SARE program. That's the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. It's a federally funded research and education program, but it is administered through the regions. So there's a lot of regional control over what questions, what are the challenges in the region, and how we resolve those questions. It also has provisions for farmland protection, to promote pasture-based livestock, to promote on-farm energy conservation and production, to develop carbon markets and tax incentives for these high mitigation practices, and to reduce farm-to-fork food waste. So as you can see, this bill really has very comprehensive approach to promoting some of those most effective drawdown actions. So finally, I want to end with just a little bit of my perspective on how the Delmarva Oasis project might be an opportunity to for national leadership in the Delmarva region. And there's a couple of reasons that I see this really a unique opportunity. And this is, I'm also speaking from within this idea of this city region sustainable development and then climate solutions agriculture. So the first is that the Delmarva has a very strong regional identity and a large land base. It has proximity to large urban markets. There's a lot of support in the region for climate action. Really interesting and likely happening for 3 states in the region, but developing ways for state collaboration to take place in a region like this would be really an excellent contribution that the Delmarva Oasis could make. And then finally, the ESLC's commitment to land, people, and community, that sense that we're really looking at the region as a whole and how we can reimagine, redesign communities in order to improve the well-being of land and people. I think that approach is exactly that city region approach. So there's excellent resonance there. And just because I want to be sure that while the Delmarva Oasis project is getting going, you don't need to wait for that to get going for you to begin to act now to cultivate climate solutions. And when we think about it from the city region frame, here's just 3 things you can think about doing. We all have a role to play. We all stand somewhere in the food system. And we also, in our many different roles as members of a family, as someone involved in work and in your community, maybe policymaking, there's many ways that you can already begin to cultivate climate solutions. The absolute #1 way, and it's such an easy way, just stop wasting food. Just stop. Just stop wasting food. The second is to begin to look for and participate in a city region food system. They're already out there, they're on the ground, they were seeded and they've been growing and being taken care of by the sustainable agriculture and local food movement. And then finally, from wherever you stand in your community, work to restore and protect healthy land, people, and community in your region.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Laura. Oh no, you got to turn the camera back on. It's Q&A.
Excellent. That's much more fun.
We have a bunch of questions.
Excellent.
And unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes, so we're going to try and just get as many answered as we can. So let's jump right into it. So Annie Richards asks, there's often a lot more tillage happening with organic 2-grain farming as the best way to disrupt weed growth. Do you have suggestions to help incentivize no-till organic farming?
To incentivize. I think that yeah. First of all, I think there's no blanket answer, that it depends on what you're growing, whether or not no-till organic farming is difficult. And I think the real learning edge in agriculture, in organic agriculture right now with no-till is no-till organic vegetable production. And so when we think of my first or short answer to this question would be, we want to focus there. We probably do need some research and development efforts in organic no-till vegetable production. And then other than that, in general, anytime we wish farmers to adopt new practices, we need to protect them from the risk of that. It is no small thing for a farmer to move from conventional tillage, for example, to no-till. And so we need to figure out how to assist in that transition, and also protect them from risk during that transition. And there's lots. We have lots of existing policies that we could use to model to promote a transition to organic no-till.
Good, thank you. All right, next question from Jim George with the Maryland Department of Environment. He asked your thoughts on global trade agreements and the relationship to transportation CO2 emissions and the city, paracity, and rural concepts you discuss.
Wow. Let's see. Let me see. International and transportation, international agreements in transportation. I think I'm going to have to take a pass on that one. Maybe we'll come back to that. I'll think about that a little more. Or maybe he could create a little more context for me to answer that.
All right, fair enough. We'll take note of that to answer later on.
Mm-hmm. But isn't that the coolest thing about these climate solutions? It's just how broad and how much you need to know, or how big a team you need to be able to really get into some of these questions. Yeah. Go ahead.
Right. No silver bullet. So Carol asked, how do we get farmers of soybeans, wheat, and corn to grow more food? And by that, Carol means less meat and more plant-based food.
Okay. Well, there's a lot in there. I think the way you get farmers who are growing corn and soybeans right now to change what they're doing is basically the same answer to the first question, which is, first of all, we need to help them through that transition, provide support for that, reduce the risks of that transition, and we need to start we need to change the way we value food in our culture. So there's again lots of ways that we can do that. To answer the question directly, and at risk of causing heart attacks in some parts of the country, one way that we could do that is begin to shift subsidies from feed, which is what we subsidize in this country, to food. So that would be one part of the equation.
Thank you. So we have another question from Mike Hardesty. He says, a significant challenge with agroforestry and the incorporation of late maturing perennial crops like nut-bearing trees is the lag time to commercial fruits and a lost income from annual crop sales. Are you aware of any grant support to offset these upfront costs, or could you just elaborate, from your perspective in general?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. It's so interesting to me how this seems to be like another chapter of what was going on in sustainable agriculture in this country 30 years ago. And we do have some really good information about how you transition an annual crop production system to a agroforestry or a mixed perennial and annual crop. And yes, that delay is absolutely an important consideration as you're making that transformation. We have great examples from 30 years ago about farmers that figured out how to do that. All of the farmers, many of the farmers that I feature in resilient agriculture have made that transition as well, and they have done it without subsidy and without risk management assistance. So we've got lots of great examples on the ground already. And I think that we just need to we need to decide what it is we value, and then begin to support farmers making those changes. And again, just we have so many examples of effective policy already that we could reuse to this new goal of climate resilience.
Thank you. All right, so we have time for a couple more questions, about 4 minutes left in Q&A. So this one is from Dalia Madi. Hopefully I pronounced that right. She was wondering if you were counting water consumption in agriculture when promoting agriculture for carbon subsequence.
Carbon sequestration? Yeah, okay. I I think that thinking about water is an important piece of this as well. And in fact, I was asked tonight to speak specifically to carbon or climate change mitigation or greenhouse gas mitigation. So I focused there, but I actually think focusing just on carbon, my own work is much more resilience, climate resilience and community resilience. And so I take a broader view than I presented tonight because I really wanted to focus on the carbon piece of this. But I think it pays up. It's unwise to focus solely on one element in this challenge. I think that primarily because there's so much potential in us in climate solutions addressing many of the most difficult problems that we face today in the 21st century. And so we want to look for those win-win-win kinds of solutions. Absolutely mitigate carbon, but also improve resilience, increase the efficiency of the use of different resources, and improve human well-being, and increase the ecosystem health. So, that's not pie in the sky. They're great examples of actions that do all of those things. And I think it would be wise for us to choose those win-win-win kinds of actions.
Great, thank you. All right, so I think we have time for one more question. And this is a pretty broad one, but I think it ties to what we're speaking about in terms of resilience. Can't pronounce this name, but they say, Laura, thank you for the presentation and bringing awareness to the rural landscape and its importance to the economy and value to Delmarva. In the event of COVID, we are seeing an increasing disappearance of agricultural pristine land and a rise in real estate. Farmers unable to cultivate due to climate impacts or wishing to generate instant return to land have been subdividing land for real estate at a far greater rate than before. Property value has increased, and the attraction of retiring demographics and people escaping urban developments are settling onto Delmarva. In a region losing its natural resilience by overbuilding, how do we increase carbon sequestration?
Oh, wow. Well, what I hear in that is it's a competition for land for different values. It's really just it boils down to a land use issue, right? And what do we need land for, and who benefits, and who pays? And I think given the way that we have typically managed those kinds of conflicts, let me say that again. I think we have a lot of models already for how to manage those conflicts well. They're not used in a lot of places, but we know how to do that in a way that that helps it, that we can take into account as a community the cost and benefits of different options, and we can promote or encourage certain uses over other uses. So hopefully I think that's a pretty direct answer. It's about land use policy, really. And I think what's changed, what climate change has done, is brought a new set of considerations into land use. And there are some examples where climate resilience is beginning to be incorporated into land use decisions or into community use decisions. And so I think maybe that's the way we need to go. It turns out that land is pretty important as a resource for community resilience in a way that we didn't know before. And so we do want to make sure we're taking that into account in land use decisions.
Great. Well, thank you for taking a stab at that question. That's the last one. And thank you again for your presentation.
Thanks.
All right. So with that note, Sally, would you turn your camera on? You're up next. All right, so Sally DeLeon is the Senior Project Manager for the University of Maryland's Office of Sustainability. Sally facilitates progress towards campus sustainability goals through public reporting and policy analysis, and she tracks and publishes sustainability metrics, supporting the implementation of the Climate Action Plan and advises campus stakeholders on carbon reduction strategies and sustainability rating systems. She has consulted for a diverse array of organizations on sustainable development topics, including universities, environmental NGOs, for-profit companies, and international development agencies. Sally, we're glad for you to be here tonight. So at this point, you may share your presentation and take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Darius. So just give me a second to take control here. Okay, great. Well, as Darius mentioned, I am a senior project manager for the University of Maryland in College Park's Office of Sustainability. And so I wear many different hats related to sustainability, but one of our major goals for the university is looking at how we can get to carbon neutrality or net zero carbon in the future. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that, but mostly ESLC has asked me to talk about carbon credits and kind of how we are thinking about that aspect of our strategies. And I was very excited to be asked to help with this program as well, because I just love the Eastern Shore and Kent County in particular, even though I don't live over there. And I definitely strongly feel that our attitude of kind of living in College Park in dense urban sort of development and approaching sustainable cities ties into the whole region, because I think many of us over here also take resilience by visiting over there. And so I do that every summer and have some strong personal history over there, and like to think about it while I'm over here without living over there. So I will, with that, we'll move forward. But some of what Laura was talking about really ties into some of the other things that we're doing that I wasn't asked to focus on. So I'm planning to mention those, but I'm also happy to answer questions about some of those broader kind of agricultural things to the best of my ability. My focus at the university is trying to help us put together a whole suite of strategies and how can we implement them to move towards net zero carbon, as well as some other goals we have like water conservation and outreach and engagement to get people to make decisions around how they're living and how that can kind of help us to build a more sustainable future. And obviously, as the land grant flagship institution for the state, we really like to do things that kind of tie in as a pilot to the state and apply our research and efforts to ways of improving Maryland, and service is a big part of our mission. So this is a timeline of where we've kind of been on the topic of climate action and carbon as an institution. So in 2007, we decided we need to figure out how to become net zero carbon eventually. And we committed to doing that. And so along with about 600-ish, 600 to 700 other higher education institutions, our former president, 2 presidents ago, signed on to what was called the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. It is now called the Climate Leadership Commitments, whereby we said, we're going to figure this out. We're going to set a target for becoming net zero, and then we're going to put together a plan. So we took 2 years of working on our first plan and released it in 2009. And it set some broad milestones and goals. And so we aimed to cut carbon emissions in half by 2020 compared to 2005 with that plan, and have been steadily working on that for the past 10 years to try to hit that milestone. By 2018, we had cut our net emissions in half. So we reached that milestone 2 years ahead of target. And most of that was focused on really direct emissions where we can avoid and reduce emissions that we have control over on campus, without kind of looking at, how can we offset or use credits at all. So by 2018, we had cut emissions in half. And the main things were that we shifted purchased electricity sources from fossil fuels to wind and solar power. And as of 2020, we're 100% renewable for all the purchased electricity that we use on campus. We've also been opening more housing on campus and near campus, which reduced commuting emissions related to students, and also have emphasized trying to have better housing opportunities for faculty and staff, so that people don't have to commute as far. We've also diverted our solid waste to landfills that capture all of the methane. So we've really reduced methane emissions related to solid waste disposal, as well as started composting and built out our recycling efforts greatly to reduce the amount of waste we're sending. And we've also been improving energy efficiency for our buildings, among other emissions reductions measures. So those are the main kind of things we were very focused on and working hard on for the first 10 years of our plan, between 2007 and 2017. So that 2018, in addition to when we hit our 50% reduction, was also really a pivotal year for climate science. So the World's Climate Science Authority, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued a special report calling for rapid reductions in global carbon emissions to prevent catastrophic climate change. And in response to that report, our Student Government Association unanimously passed a resolution asking us to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2025. So our original target to get to net zero, which I didn't mention in the slide before, was actually 2050. And that is still our official target. But we've been asked by the students to really figure out, is there a way that we can do this sooner? Because it's urgent. And we have faculty as well really focused on that. So as an institution, we've been, for the last 2 years, really trying to look at how can we get to reducing and avoiding our emissions such that eventually we are zero emissions, but in the interim, speed up the process and get to net zero more quickly than we originally thought. So over the following 18 months, the Sustainability Council considered options for meeting this ambitious target. And in May of last year, our Sustainability Council actually recommended that the university strive to achieve the goal and try to go carbon neutral by 2025. So at this time, we have a new president, and the university is considering that, but hasn't made a decision yet. So these are some photos that kind of go with that history. And so on the top left, that's one of our students who then went on to become also a sustainability associate and a graduate student. And she worked closely with dining services, as well as our office, as well as the School of Public Policy. So behind her, you can see that there's a cool food sign, and it says delicious climate action. And what she has is some samples of plant-based food to offer in the dining halls. And we have kind of events to engage students and others in trying different kinds of foods. We have a food truck that tries to emphasize kind of plant-forward, as well as more chicken as opposed to red meat and things like that to kind of get people to experiment and try new foods. And in 2018, we were the first university that signed on to this cool food commitments, which means that we're also now measuring food-related emissions, and we track all of our purchasing for the dining halls. What is organic, what is meat, what different types of meat, what's local. And we use that to work with the World Resources Institute to estimate our footprint associated with our food consumption. And along with a lot of other organizations, hospitals, restaurants, food services, and some other universities, we're working to reduce that with targets by 2030 as a group. So a lot of our efforts have also focused on local food. And we have Turp Farm, which is a farm in Prince George's County near campus, in collaboration with our School of Agriculture and Natural Resources, whereby we supply a lot of the food to our dining halls from there. But we also work with a lot of local farms around the region to try to source products and help to build kind of climate resilient agriculture in that way, as well as give people the opportunity to change their eating habits in ways that they sometimes find are really surprising, that they like some of the things so much. So a lot of our chefs have been really focused on kind of cool plant forward recipes, and they do demonstrations and those kinds of things. So that's one thing I wanted to hit on because it really ties into the Delmarva Peninsula, and a lot of our food does come from there. In particular, a lot of the chicken that the University of Maryland consumes comes from Delmarva, but also some of the other crops and things do too. So that our students are really trying to lead on this. And then we have faculty who are involved in the IPCC and the report that I mentioned, and are focused on land use and the climate impacts of land. And then we also have faculty involved in America's Pledge and measuring the United States contributions to the Paris Agreement over the last 4 years, despite the fact that we left the agreement and now have gone back in. So we, along with a lot of other universities, signed on in 2017 to the We Are Still In commitment, and have been trying to work and network on moving forward to achieve our nationally determined contributions that were set when we originally joined the Paris Agreement. So those are some things, those are some kind of cultural pressures on our campus. And obviously the faculty who are involved in these things and the students really want us to figure out how we can lead and how we can use the university as kind of an experimental way of getting to, how do we get to net zero? Because we as a society need to figure it out, and how can we do it? We have installed solar on campus, so there's a photo there, and a lot of our faculty also focus on renewable power. But I will say that that solar panel, which is on one of our parking garages, that along with, we have 4 large installations on the College Park campus, they provide less than 1% of our electricity that we consume. So they're there because they are important and people really want to see solar. But in terms of how we're going to get to net zero, they're just making a tiny dent in the electricity use for a large research university. And then a last thing that's recently really of emphasis from our students and our new president is environmental justice. And so the way that we get there, if we're thinking about doing things off campus, we're being really asked to think about how can we address many stones at one time. So all of that kind of leads us into the opportunity I was asked to talk most about today, which is that we have begun using carbon credits after we spent the first 10 years really focused only on direct reductions and mitigation that we could do from what we're consuming. In 2017, we began looking into credits that we could purchase to invest in opportunities off campus and eliminate some of our negative contributions to climate change well before we can eliminate all of our sources of emissions, because a lot of the technology that we're getting down to is the type of thing that takes millions of dollars and years to kind of change over. And so we started investing in offsite emissions reduction projects in 2017 to eliminate the climate impact of air travel in particular. And this slide gives you kind of just the overview, which I think Trey is going to talk more about. I actually just added this while Laura was talking because I wanted to make sure that folks understood kind of what is a carbon offset. But the basic idea is that on the left side of this scale, you have emissions, which for our university are coming mostly from power, as well as air travel, and then some other transportation sources. And then we have some smaller ones from agriculture and refrigerants and things like that, similar to what Laura talked about with Project Drawdown. We can offset the impact of these by investing in projects and measuring by ton how much carbon those projects take out of the atmosphere and draw out or prevent from entering. And we match them up. It's like we get a debit against the negative emissions or the bad emissions and offset them with good investments until we can get totally off of the bad emissions. So we've begun incorporating that now. And I'll give you a quick look at sort of what happened to our emissions. If you see the trend here, we have successfully reduced our emissions since 2005. And you can see that the yellow and the red are really shrinking over time. And so we've done things like refrigerant management We've done switching over to a lot of wind power and some solar. So those are kind of, I think, the top two things on Project Drawdown. And those we've brought down to almost nothing now. And as of 2020, purchased electricity actually becomes zero. So then the other opportunities where we can control, so we have an on-campus power plant, that's the gray, and that runs on natural gas and provides all of the heat as well as much of the air conditioning, chilled water, and much of the electricity for our campus. It's a very efficient cogeneration plant. It runs on a relatively less intense fuel for direct emissions, but it is still probably our biggest challenge with regards to getting to net zero. And then air travel and commuting, we don't totally control those because we don't own the vehicles. So those are a big chunk, and that's where we started to use carbon offsets. So you can see in the last 3 years, a gray debit at the bottom of this graph, and that is offsetting all of our air travel as well as all of our undergraduate commuting, because the students, as I said in 2018, said they really wanted urgent action, and they set aside money for the Office of Sustainability to work with them to offset their commuting emissions. So we've been doing that with them since then. When you look at the future, if we decide to go carbon neutral by 2025, we will not be able to switch the power plant over by then, because that's very near term, to totally renewable power, just based on the way our district energy system is set up. All our buildings run on steam. So we can switch it over years, and we are planning to do that, but it will take longer than 2025 to get everything switched over. So we'd be looking at possibly offsetting more. And you can see we have a pretty big footprint. So right now we have been offsetting about 50,000 to 60,000 tons with the air travel and the transportation emissions that we're looking at. And if we started to consider the power plant, we'd be up in the 200,000 metric tons a year range, which is a big appetite for projects that help to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. Because we were expecting eventually to have to look at this, in 2015, we created a work group, and this is available online for anyone who wants to look at it, but it was a cross-campus work group with technical expertise from our Environmental Finance Center, as well as students, faculty, staff who contribute to our emissions and control some of the energy infrastructure. And we put out recommendations that were mostly adopted by our council about how to start incorporating carbon credits into our strategies. So these were the objectives for this work group. And I would say that we fully achieved, in a way that we could move forward starting in 2017, objectives 1 and 2, so that we could do them, which basically was figure out how are we going to procure registered carbon credits such that we know that no one else is claiming them, and that they are additional carbon drawn out of the atmosphere that wouldn't have happened without our procurement efforts. They're real, they're measurable, and we can count them against our emissions and feel confident that they are in fact a real debit that is canceling out our negative emissions. And then the second part was we needed a plan for how are we going to pay for these things, and kind of how are we going to put the portfolio together to offset particularly air travel, which was increasing, and we knew we didn't have any other way to address through technology yet. We can encourage people to fly less, but that wasn't, due to the nature of sort of research and also the fact that we want to support global education for students, it wasn't possible to just eliminate it. So those two, I think we succeeded well. And then 3 and 4, we considered these and are still working on them. And so this is kind of what I want to talk more about today. So how can the university's participation in the marketplace for carbon offsets create some new opportunities for local and regional projects, which like what could happen on Delmarva and other places, I think in Maryland, if there's interest and the technical support and everything to do it. And then how can we participate in the carbon offset marketplace through non-financial transactions? So having students involved, having faculty and staff consult on things, and other in-kind contributions, and we've begun doing some of that recently. But we're still working on 3 and 4, and those are probably the harder ones to do. So 2019, we had to decide, okay, we're going to offset annually 60,000 tons of carbon. So we're going to need a way to procure that many offsets that are verified and do it in a way that we can pull off. So we went through a public procurement process, and we work with these two contractors, and we set it up in a way that any institution in the USM system can use it if they need carbon credits. And they also could, I think we have under public procurement, $25,000 or less. We can go any route we want. But the total footprint for the University of Maryland College Park was definitely going to be more than that to offset. So we needed to have a public procurement approved process where we have invited people to apply. And so we have contracts with these two, and they can also work with other government entities. So what do we need to kind of keep in mind moving forward? So far, we have procured credits, but we haven't been able to procure credits that are verified from Maryland that fit into the climate agreement that we're part of, because they have to be fitting with methodology that is approved by that president's climate commitment. And so we've been looking at ways to kind of find alternative pathways to meet our goal and offset our emissions. As I said, we're still emphasizing direct reductions, like avoiding and reducing emissions that we have full control over and that we cause first. And some of those, particularly the power plant, are quite expensive to finance and switch over. It's a lot of digging up of old steam pipes and replacing them, as well as putting in different district energy technology that is expensive to site and a lot of construction costs. So we need to conserve our limited funding so that we can pay for the actual switching away. But we still want to do the urgency of having an offset. So we have to really consider what affordable credits can we get. We want to make sure they're real, robust, and verified, and in a way where we can't spend tons of time doing that. So we work with primarily native energy, which I mentioned on that. And that they're approved for use with Second Nature, which oversees the commitment we've signed on to, the voluntary program where we're reducing our emissions. We want there to be minimal administrative burden because we have a pretty small Office of Sustainability and we wear a lot of hats. So we can't spend a lot of time shopping around, and that's why we have the contract with the suppliers I mentioned, so that we can kind of task them with things and then try to work with faculty to find other pathways. And then also, we know that the cost of offsets can change and fluctuate. So we're looking for ways that we can reduce future financial risks. And so one way to do that is that we buy extra and kind of save them up in times when we have extra funding and things like that. But alternatively, we could set up a project where we just always are sourcing offsets that and help build a project. So those are some things that we're considering. In our procurement process, we emphasize these things, which are also emphasized in the work group report, which is that we really want to support projects that have a benefit to Maryland, and particularly the health of the Chesapeake Bay, if possible. So when we say resilience, we don't just mean ecological. It could also be having an economic resilience impacts, as well as improving the health and well-being of people in Maryland. But we were interested in having these types of projects, and to date, haven't been able to find a lot of opportunities to directly buy credits from them. Although we have been able to partner with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to support tree planting on agricultural buffers, although we're not actually quantifying and counting the carbon with that. It's kind of just layered on top of verified credits. So we're looking for other ways, and these are some of the ways that seem doable with our agricultural history and with what we've been able to do on some of our research and education centers. And so a lot of how we're going to kind of move forward now on those objectives 3 and 4 that I mentioned is by trying a lot of things and seeing what works and what doesn't work. We have the advantage of being a research institution. So we have some faculty interested in helping with things like this. And then as our limited time in our office, and we kind of channel where faculty are interested in partnering. And then reaching out to places like ESLC, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay, and others to find out if there are opportunities for partnerships where we might explore something that could work. We're also very aware that in Maryland with landholders, it's difficult to do verification. So we've been trying to find some alternative ways to make it less expensive and easier. And we have the opportunity to do peer verification through our agreement. So we could work with other universities to try to make something that would work. And then in terms of affordability, I think we're trying to look for ways of being able to buy more expensive credits so that we can support local projects more. We did build in some funding so that we don't have to get the bottom of the barrel offsets, but a lot of the things that we're interested in, like afforestation and wetland and cropland credits, are too expensive to kind of fit with not derailing our on-campus mitigation. So that's a challenge that we have. So yeah, that's all I think I have to say to you all, and I look forward to questions.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Sally. All right. So we have a few questions, so I'm just going to jump right into them. So we have a question from Paula Reeder, who says that Sally, UMD is leading by example is commendable. However, the university only occupies 1,335 acres in Maryland, about the size of 3 to 4 small Eastern Shore farms, many of which are doing little to nothing to adopt to sustainable agriculture and carbon sequestration practices. What is UMD doing to reach out to and recruit farmers and other community members to follow this example?
Sure. And I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but I will do it to the best of my ability. And then I can definitely connect anyone with the best people. So our School of Agriculture and Natural Resources, in addition to the College Park campus, we have research and education centers around the state, and we have extension offices. And Professor Sarah Vaya, who I think historically was entomology, but now works for Extension and has had a long career as a soil scientist, soil sort of just ecological, like she loves all things ecological and looking particularly at insects and how they tie into agriculture. So she's in Howard County and she does specific outreach on this related to how we can address climate challenges through farming. And then all of our extension offices have resources, and all of our research and education centers do conservation tillage and cover crops to demonstrate and farm. So we have 2 of them on the Eastern Shore, one in Y and one on the lower Eastern Shore, which I can't remember, I think Somerset County. But those are open to visits from anybody. As far as I know, I visited several of them and they're very welcoming. And then the extension offices have resources to help support and toolkits to show kind of how to do these things. And yeah, so I think that's the main way that we're trying to reach out on that topic.
All right, thank you. So we have time for one more question. Sandy from Annapolis, she asks, is the climate action impact plan the university has done unique, or are other universities doing this as well?
Sure.
And I do want to ask you to add another part to that. If you can explain how professionals like us can help with students' experiential learning opportunities, just from a university doing this type of work.
Okay. It is not unique to have a climate action plan. Many universities have them. And as I mentioned, the climate commitment, which is a voluntary kind of 2007 push, but people have signed on to it since. And part of that is that you have to have a climate action plan with strategies, and you have to update it at least every 5 years if you've signed on to that. So there are like well over 600 universities, and all of the university system of Maryland has signed on and has some kind of plan. And like many other, like American University, they have a plan in DC, George Washington, and I believe Johns Hopkins does too. So yeah, that's pretty common. It's not common to offset 100% of your air travel. So we actually were the first university in the first large research university that addressed all of our air travel, including education abroad, through carbon offsets. There are many others that have addressed like a portion of it. So I think like UCLA offsets all their business travel at this point. American University offsets all their air travel. They're not a large research university like we are. So yeah, so that's, and you can easily find them by Googling. And then with regards to experiential learning for students, I think just having internships and communicating them to our office, as well as the President's Promise kind of career center at the University of Maryland, is one way. And we have a newsletter that we put out monthly. We on our website highlight opportunities around the state for students. We also have an alternative breaks program that works with some organizations around the state. And then also collaborating with faculty. So as I mentioned, we have some faculty interested in this topic of carbon sequestration and kind of how we can measure it around the state. And depending on their time, they are often will facilitate students who are working under them, or they're advising in their courses to help do projects and research for organizations. And then the last thing is we have the Partnership for Action, Learning, and Sustainability, which is a way that we partner with counties and cities around the state. And it's like a year-long process where our architecture school pairs different departments and faculty up to do specific projects, and students get to do the projects. So it helps the students, and then it also saves money and time for county government and city government.
All right. Well, thanks, Sally. I think that wraps up the Q&A. And just again, thank you so much for your presentation and for being a part of this tonight. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. All right. So next up is Trey Hill. Trey, mind turn your camera on? All right. So Trey Hill is the owner and manager of Harborview Farms in Rock Hall, Maryland, a fourth-generation grain farmer. He and his family sustainably produce corn, wheat, and soybeans for the Mid-Atlantic region. At Harborview Farms, he and his team are breaking new ground with innovative and creative farming techniques, combining the wisdom and traditional practices with forward-thinking, environmentally conscious solutions that are shaping the future of the agriculture industry. We're really glad to have Trey here today. With that, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let me get everything moving here. Hopefully everything works. So I own and run Harborview Farms with my father. We consider ourselves all kinds of different words. I'm going to go through some of those words and some of the definitions that I think sometimes get confused as we talk about climate farming and sustainable, regenerative. There's lots of different things, and I like to look at them. So sustainability is probably the one that everybody knows, and I consider myself a sustainable farmer. And by that, it's simply the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level. So I think that by being a fourth generation farmer and looking at a lot of the farmers around me, many of us have multi-generational, or guys that have started out, have lasted a long time, and there's a lot of longevity within the farm community, which is indicative to me of being able to be maintained. However, if you look at the way we farm and the things that have transpired, it's constantly moving. It's a moving target. So I don't think we can look at what we're doing in the here and now as sustainable, but what we're doing moving forward and how we're changing and how we're adapting to the climate and how we're adapting to social demands. So I thought as a farmer, it'd be great to kind of explain what sustainability means to me. And I thought, how can I do that? It becomes relatively complicated. So I got on my whiteboard and decided to draw a picture of it. And this is kind of what I ended up with. Granted, my writing is not very legible. That's just a genetic trait. But if you look at this, sustainability is in the middle. And then I have climate, agronomy, environment, financial, and social. But all of these things are what go into a sustainable farm. So as we focus on one thing, like I work with Shore Rivers a tremendous amount. So their one thing is typically water quality, or the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Then I work with folks in the carbon markets. Their thing is how much carbon are we sequestering? Nutrient management, technology. I work with a lot of technology folks. I work with people in the bug world and soil health world, which is completely different as well. So it becomes increasingly complex as we move forward. It's very difficult to explain, and I haven't really figured out a good way to visualize it because so many things are moving, and there's so many moving parts in the farm and within the soil. So I'll kind of go on from there and look at sustainability and kind of the way I've interpreted it into a much simpler form. This is a picture of my farm. It's Harbor View Farms because that's Rock Hall Harbor in the background. Obviously, the bay and the water are very near and dear to my family. We live in Rock Hall where there's a lot of watermen, there's a lot of boaters, there's a lot of folks that are there all the time to enjoy the water. So I'm growing up in that environment, and our goal was not to pollute, obviously. But I think that sustainability as a society kind of comes down to one's level of desire to make the world better. So how much does society want to make the world better, and in what direction do we do it, and what is better, and what part of the world is that? Is it climate change? Is it hunger? There's so many different issues. So for me, it's kind of trying to figure out how that regulates. So when we start talking about farmers having to be climate smart and sequester carbon into the soil, are we holding the farmers to a different level of responsibility than society if we expect or mandate farming to be climate friendly? Every business has the opportunity to be more climate friendly. So we have to look at the different things that determine whether or not farmers are climate friendly. So it's easy to say farmers should change. And I agree with that. I mean, we do have to change, we have to evolve. And I'm very much a climate smart farmer, and I agree with it, but we also have to look at what are we asking farmers to do, and are we requesting the same of all businesses and all of society simultaneously as we request this of farmers? I think this is a question that we kind of have to ask to look at it from the farmer's perspective as opposed to the outsider's perspective. So what are you thinking as a farmer, as folks are coaching you and asking you to farm a different way, when your farm has been successful, it's been sustainable because it's still being maintained, it's thriving, you're making money, your kids are in it, you've got this family enterprise, but yet everyone's telling you to do things differently. So you have to look at what causes a farmer to change. To me, it comes down to these 5 factors: financial, environment, climate, social, and agronomic. So you have to take into account all of these. And each one of these factors are what are going to determine whether or not a farmer adapts and adopts some of these new practices. So you have to view them all equally, financial obviously being the biggest one. Environment, you have to look at water quality, we have to look at pesticides, climate, social. A lot of it's customer driven. What are the customers demanding? Do they want really inexpensive food? Do they want really inexpensive chicken? Or do they want something more where we can add value? And then of course, agronomic. We have to have high yields. Most of us that grow, myself, as an example, would be corn, wheat, soybeans, and barley. I compete on a global market. I sell everything based on the price at the Chicago Board of Trade, which is global, right? Right now we're having weather issues in South America, so the price of corn is up. China's starting to import more grain, so the prices have been going up. But yet when we had, so everything is interrelated. So if I don't have yields and I'm not efficient and an efficient, low cost producer of these grains, then I can't make money. Then I don't stay in business. So kind of resilient. Another word, I like this word. It's able to withstand, to recover quickly. That's what I think represents farmers, right? Farmers, we go through droughts, we go through rain, when we get a hurricane and our crops blow down, we have to really adapt quickly. So everyone's upset that we had a hurricane, but the farmers, our whole crop can be lost. A drought the same way, or we might get a 20% drop in the market price of corn overnight, essentially. So things like that are what make farmers resilient. So we're really adaptable to change. I think we can change, and we will change very quickly because farmers are resilient because they're forced to. We experience things in our business and our personal lives that often overlap quite a bit that most folks don't really experience. And I don't think it's always fully comprehended by folks looking in on farming. So to get down to the nuts and bolts of why we're here tonight, what is carbon smart farming? I like carbon smart farming because it's fairly simple. It's much easier to explain than sustainability, right? It's no till, meaning we don't till the soil, because when you till the soil, the soil releases the carbon that's been put in. We use cover crops so that we're utilizing sunlight all year round. Plants are naturally sequestering carbon from the air and putting them into the soil. That's what plants do. It's photosynthesis. So by growing a single crop, letting the field lay fallow through the winter, we're not utilizing all that sunlight. We're not maximizing the amount of carbon that's being sequestered into the soil. So if we can no-till with cover crops and hopefully have an overlap. You can see a picture of us planting here. This is our planter planting soybeans. Now this field was quite challenging. It was a little more than what we had anticipated. It got a little thicker than we wanted. So this was cereal rye, crimson clover, vetch, all mixed together. And it was probably about 7 or 8 tons of biomass. There's about 7 or 8 tons per acre of material out there. It ended up being about a foot thick after it was mashed down. And before we planted it, you couldn't even walk through it. It was taller than me. So starting to get all that. So we're trying to utilize as much sunlight and grow as much product as we can on that field, not just the crops we're growing, but also the cover crops. And what that's doing is it's pulling carbon out of the air into the soil. And for farmers, there's a multitude of reasons to do this. We're increasing organic matter. We're increasing the porosity of the soil. In other words, the soil will percolate better, so we get less sheeting off, we get less erosion, we get less nutrient runoff, and then we're also sequestering nutrients. So all of those things combined are what make carbon smart farming. So by doing this, we're sequestering hopefully over a ton of carbon into the soil per acre. That as long as we stay in the absence of tillage, we'll stay sequestered there, thereby building our soils up. But hopefully also, well, one, offsetting climate change, but hopefully also we can figure out a way to get paid for that, which we have, and I'll get into. So this is a field. This field's ready to be planted. So this would have been a similar field prior to the planter coming in. So one thing that was nice this year in the spring with COVID and everybody being stressed out and locked down, we had a lot of fields through the county that looked like this. So that was kind of a nice side benefit. So we're building a lot of diversity with the cover crops that we hadn't really anticipated. So by having the cover crops grow longer, by having them start to flower and getting different color flowers, we're getting a lot more nuance to it than we ever thought possible. When we first started doing this 10 years ago, we never thought about pollinators. The bees love these fields, the birds. We've got better deer, turkeys, pretty much everything, but also the smell, the experience of farming is entirely different. So when I was a kid, what really made me want to farm was freshly plowed fields, right? That's what I did. As a kid, we plowed, and I loved it. There's no better smell in the world to me than a freshly plowed field. And walking through the soil when it's soft and fluffy after it's just been plowed, seeing the big machines running, that's what really made me want to farm. So trying to get a mindset together of the reason I chose the career I did was this beautiful, this full sensory overload of plowing fields to now trying to enjoy this has been quite an undertaking. So it's not just a financial or just what farmers want to do. There's a full psychological shift that you have to do in order to farm like this. This is entirely different than what we used to do. So this is us planting another field at the home farm. So if you see this and you compare what we're doing here to a field that's been freshly plowed, the mindset is completely altered. It makes it very difficult. It's taken me over a decade to get really comfortable with this. And there's a lot of times in the spring, I'm still not real comfortable. The crops are coming up through this. It takes weeks to be able to see the corn plants coming up in the rows. Whereas if you plow a field or they're brown, you can see the corn right away. You can drive by the field, see it. Whereas now we're walking every field, looking at it. And once it all comes up and looks pretty, then I'm good. But there's still some anxiety there. So as we ask farmers to shift, as we ask people to change the way they're doing it, I think a lot of people overlook the mental dynamic of it, of having to change the way we do things completely. But it's not just a subtle change. This is drastic. It's completely different. So if we look at what we need to farm this way, there's really not a whole lot to it. We're eliminating all the tillage. So we're running a planter. The planter has to have certain attachments, but this is a John Deere planter. So we've added things to it, but not a whole lot of expense. So the opportunity is there. It's just a matter of figuring out how to incentivize farmers to do it, because they can use the current tools they have. They can use the current planters they have. It's just getting that mindset together, but also financially incentivizing it, but also socially incentivizing it. Another piece of equipment that we use is a crimper. We do use this occasionally when things are tall. We have a crimper on the planter as well, on one of our planters, but not all. So getting the stuff rolled down is something that's fairly important, particularly in corn. Soybeans, not as much. So the price to get in, the entry point of this, the financial tax that is on carbon smart farming is really not that great. Like I said, I think it's more mental. Here's another picture of us planting. The yellow you see is rapeseed with some cereal rye, and there's probably some clover underneath. So what we're trying to do is get a closer mimicry of this natural world. So as we start to plant green and plant into fields that have the flowers, that have all this stuff, what we're doing is offsetting what we're doing with our crops. So with the crop with corn or soybeans, we're growing a single crop in a field through the summer, which is not ecologically great, right? It's a single crop, but it's what we need to do to grow food. That's the most efficient way to grow food. So what we're doing in the off season is building diversity around that. So by doing this, we're building the diversity in the soil. We're building the root systems in the soil. We're building the soil up with microorganisms, fungus, bacteria, everything else, so that we then in the growing season, we take some of that back, but it makes it better for our crops. So as we do that, we're starting to do now is add a lot of technology. There's a lot of companies that are coming in. We have data, we have better data sets, better chemicals, better seeds. We do use chemicals to burn off the cover crops after we plant. And what we're trying to do is figure out how to minimize those. How do we use them better? How do we use the data better? And then how do we better utilize our nutrients? And then also, as we start to develop soil health, one thing we've always focused on is, you have better water holding capacity, you have all this great diversity, but what's the correlation to soil health and yield? And where does the technology have to come in? So for us, with the insects, a lot of times you can find a balance in the field, but sometimes they get out of balance. So the correlation of soil health and yield isn't necessarily linear. Sometimes it does go up. In a drought, we have a lot better resilience. But then we get a bug infestation where we're using less insecticides. Sometimes it goes down. So trying to figure out that balance is pretty essential. Nutrients, we're still trying to figure that out as well, because before, when we planted into a field and didn't have cover crops, or we killed the cover crops early, the field still had nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that was available to our plants and our seeds as we planted them. Well, now the goal of the cover crops is to pull all these plants up, pull all these nutrients up. So there's really no nutrients left in the soil because they're all up in the plants. So trying to figure out how to plant and manage our nutrients differently. We don't need more nutrients. We don't, maybe a little bit less nutrients, but trying to figure all that out is really taking a lot of time. And there hasn't been a whole lot of research done on it. So as farmers, a lot of it's just being done on farm. I'm in a network with quite a few growers and their social media and different things and magazines, but there's not a lot of university data. There's not a lot of industry data as well. So trying to figure all this out can be a little cumbersome. And what we know about soil health is shockingly little. We sent away our normal soil sample gives us our nitrogen, phosphorus, pH, and kind of the normal minerals associated with growing a crop. This year we started to send away some DNA samples, and the one sample had 225 different, that says fungi, should be fungi, and 425 bacteria. And I really don't know what any of those do. So there's a balance there that we're trying to achieve, but we don't really know what the balance is supposed to be and what's optimal for growing crops. Is it different for corn and soybeans? What's the relationship of these fungus and bacteria to the chemicals that we use? There's really not much research on it. There's some experts out there, but it's not really cut and dry like we normally would have, or like we would like it in a conventional system. So as the carbon markets are evolving, we're starting to see more incentives for farmers, which I think we need. If the farmer's not getting paid to do this, there's not a whole lot of incentive for the farmer to do that because there's a certain risk associated with it. You have the possibility of lower yields. You got a different way of thinking about the way you farm. You might have a failure, plus the uncomfortableness of just doing something new. So one thing that I really like is these new markets that are carbon markets. One that I've used is Nori. I got paid for carbon credits last year. I talked to Sally about maybe marketing to the University of Maryland, which I think would be a really cool proposition to have Maryland farmers producing carbon credits for the University of Maryland. The problem is it's still a very fledgling market. There's a lot to be hashed out. Nori tried to sell to Microsoft, for example, who just bought a bunch, and they didn't like the methodology that Nori uses. And now we have a lot of different companies that are all setting up these carbon markets for farmers and trying to figure out how, as a farmer, I'm going to get paid for it and not have it go to the middleman or the broker of them is going to be tricky. I like Nori. Nori charged 10% as a brokerage fee, and I sold my credits for $15 or $16.50 a ton, and I received $15. We're going through a second round now where I'm trying to get more initiated. But just in the last year, all of these companies have started their own carbon markets. Bayer, Land O'Lakes, Farmers Business Network, Ecosystems Market Consortium, Indigo Ag, Microsoft. So I think that's where there's folks on the Eastern Shore, whether it's a Shore Rivers group, an ESLC, no matter who it is, someone that could help us work through the complexity of these systems. It becomes very, very complicated as a farmer to try to figure out, who do I partner with? What's the data requirement? How much time is it going to take? How do I partner with other farmers to make it easier? Is there a consultant that could come in and help us kind of manage several farms together so we would have selling power, buying power? All of these things are quite tricky to me. I had the experience going solo through Nori, and I'm not sure where, like I said, that's been a great one, but I think that that's part of the incentive program. So we have the cover crop program, which is great in Maryland. That gives us a clear advantage as farmers for entering into these carbon markets, because we're already getting paid to do cover crops, which is a big part of carbon farming. So I think having that opportunity here on the Delmarva is really the perfect foundation for getting a more robust carbon market, as well as a more robust carbon geography, which I don't think has really been done anywhere yet. So here's an example. I just wanted to throw this in. This was research from this year. It's a little off topic slightly, but basically this was a field with a lot of cover crop, and the straight lines are what the model predicted the yield to be based on nitrogen rates, and the dots are where the yield is. So if you look at the two on the left, basically all that's showing is I got a lot of nitrogen from my cover crops, so I can use less nitrogen. So that's kind of the summation of it. It's a bit of a complicated thing, but I just wanted to throw this kind of got thrown in, but I had to show it because part of carbon smart farming is also reducing nutrients, which also helps the environment, and kind of just trying to prove that through one quick slide. Why I do all this? For my kids, right? This is why we all do what we do. So being sustainable, climate friendly, that's all a big part of it. So for me, some of it's altruistic, some of it's business, but it's really, this is part of my social part of it. So kind of the future as I see it, what I'd like to see on the Delmarva is, well, one, carbon footprinting, carbon sequestration, but also as we look into this, not just focusing on the carbon market, but starting to focus on the consumer, because the consumer really drives what farmers do. If folks want organic, farmers produce organic. If folks want more vegetables that are locally grown, farmers will grow more vegetables that are locally grown. So I think a lot of times it's lost that we don't have consumer-driven response because farmers aren't really facing the consumer. And I think with all the technology, with the carbon markets, like the carbon market I'm doing is all blockchain, so everything's being recorded, is how do I get into the grocery store? How do people know how their food was grown and who grew it? And I think that farmers really take a lot of pride in what they do, and they're happy with what they do, and they're perfectly happy to share it. It's just that we don't have that opportunity. So I think that if we can get there, it would really make a big difference in getting the farmer to kind of circle back with the consumer, whether it's through, websites, social media, whatever. So where you would buy a bag of pretzels, scan it, and you would see the farmer that grew the wheat. To me, that would give us more of the social plus the financial. And then, what would a Delmarva chicken look like? You have Vidalia onions, examples all over the place of different places that have branded local things, bourbon, for example. But what about a carbon friendly Delmarva chicken that was slightly more expensive than the chicken that's grown in Arkansas or Texas? Would folks want that? Is Philadelphia, DC, Baltimore, rather than having an organic chicken at a premium price that has a high carbon footprint? How about a Delmarva chicken that's very low carbon? Maybe the farmers on the Delmarva could then get a little more premium for their corn if they're selling into the carbon market. So they would get the $15 for the carbon market, plus maybe a couple more cents per bushel of corn in order to help produce the Delmarva chicken. And then I'll finish with just kind of my favorite quote. This one is, many small people who in many small places do many small things that can alter the face of the world. It's kind of how I view the world. So I think that everyone here tonight is probably of the same mindset, that we can all do our own little part. And then I think that everything changes on a mass scale. So that's what I'll finish with.
All right, Trey. Well, thanks again for that presentation, and really appreciate the inspiration you shared, especially with your kids in the slides. It's always for the next generation. That's what it's always about. So we do have a few questions, so I'm going to jump right into them. So the first question, common farm crops tend to be wheat, corn, and soy. How can farmers increase the biodiversity of crops while still being profitable?
That's a good question. I don't really know. Right now, that's the way the markets are set up. That's where the demand is for us. So that's what we use to feed chickens. So there's vegetable crops, but they don't really require as much space. If you look around the globe, South America, as they develop their farming systems, they're growing corn and beans. As you look at China, as it's developing its farming system, it's corn and beans. Australia's wheat. So if you look at the major growing regions of the world, that's where we get the most calories per acre, is through or most feed per acre, most fuel per acre, however you're gauging it. But it's in these high yielding corn, wheat, and soybean crops, which are profitable. We make a good living on it. They're effective, they're efficient. The markets work really well because the Chicago Board of Trade. So there's a supply and demand cycle for that.
Thank you. All right, so this question is a pretty straightforward question, yes or no, but I'm going to ask you to elaborate. So they ask, are you concerned about sea level rise on your farm?
Yes, I am. We've got a few acres, not a lot, that have already been flooded, that have already been salted out. We've got a farm down the road that we put in some wetland, or we didn't, the owner put in some wetlands last year to kind of counter it. So we're no longer farming where it floods. But yeah, we're starting to get some high moon tides and whatnot that are starting to flood some of our fields. I don't know how much it'll, what percentage of what we grow on, but yeah, it's definitely a big concern of ours.
Gotcha. All right, so Richard Wilkins asks, what rate of carbon do you store per acre of corn or soy?
The average on what we've done so far it worked out to be about a ton per acre. They did it through the Comet Farm model. If we grow more cover crops, it goes up, and they incorporate weather and droughts, it goes down. But it averaged out to be about a ton per acre per year, and didn't really differentiate between corn and beans.
Okay. All right, so we have one more question, I believe, from Jennifer DeMoy. She asks, who is responsible for third-party verification in these voluntary carbon markets? Is this a challenge the farmers? Is this challenge the farmers' management decision?
I can only speak to the market that I've participated in, which was, like I said, the small startup called Nori. They had a third-party verifier called Aster Global that did the verification process. So we put all our data into Nori, which then they built I don't know what they did. They did some kind of coding so that it would flow straight through to Comet Farm model. So we didn't have to go through and manually put everything into Comet Farm model. Then once it was in there, it was then reviewed, and I got called and interviewed, and also had to provide some receipts, verification and whatnot, to a third-party verifier called Aster Global, which was just one of the people they had to choose from. They had several different third-party verifiers for me to choose from. I called, and they were nice, and we got along well, and that's who did the verification process.
Okay. So Trey, I lied to you. We got some other questions, and we still got time, so I want to ask them for you. Mike Hardesty asks, can you elaborate on some of the challenges with soil carbon right now? Are you interested in greater exposure to markets, price?
Well, I think at $15 an acre, that's a great question, Mike. At $15 an acre, it's not really going to change the way folks farm. That's kind of the big problem that I see. You figure we get about $50 an acre to do cover crops, and that's just the cover crop portion of it. So if you go out of the state of Maryland, say you're in Illinois, and then farmer's going to get $15 an acre and is required to do cover crops on top of it, he's already down $50. So that's what makes it tricky. I think that we need the carbon markets, and I think that $15 seems to be kind of the rule of, even in Europe, where they've got the Green Deal. They're still not really high. They're tying it to subsidies over there. I'd like to see it be on the consumer end. That gets us, I'm not going to call it a double dip, but a double award. So one is the climate award. So if you look at all the different portions of sustainability that I had, where there's 5 different things, well, one of them's climate. So we treat that as the $15, but then we also look at consumer demand. Can we have a carbon smart chicken? Can we have in the grocery store, can we have carbon smart bread? And I think as climate change impacts people more greatly and it becomes more impactful on our lives, you're going to see, more solar panels, electric cars, but people are going to make better, are going to have better decision making and be willing to pay more for products that take the climate into account. And I think that's where the real opportunity is to get not just the carbon money, but also hopefully get incentivized on the other end, which is the consumer, the food. And if it's raised better and it's raised more responsibly, hopefully people are willing to put a little bit of a premium in there, that then translates into more money for the farmer, which I think would help everyone.
Gotcha. All right, Trey. Well, that wraps up the Q&A. Thanks again for being here tonight and for your presentation. I think everybody really enjoyed it. And as I mentioned to everybody, we're keeping track of all the questions that have come in. So, we're gonna, try and wrangle the panelists to see if they'll answer some of those after the fact. But we really appreciate all the participation. So at that point, Trey, you're good to go. And I want to take a moment to shift gears to my colleagues, Jim Bass and Tyler Chandler. Tyler's our coastal resilience intern, and they're just going to share a bit more about what's ahead and wrap this up.
So this is a photo voice challenge. This is designed to have participants go out into their communities and take pictures of places that are important to them that might be vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change, with the goal of ESLC sort of bringing these pictures together to build a portfolio that we can approach lawmakers and local leaders with to say, hey, this is all these places that the community values, and this is what's at stake if sea level rise isn't combated and if nothing is done. So the main idea and our goal for this is to have the community tell their story through their pictures that they submit to ESLC, and we'll use them to try to push for change at the state and regional level. So that's my quick spiel for Photo Voice. If you'd like to participate, we'll send out more info in the morning with the recording of this presentation, and you can submit your, you'll find all the submission details and the sort of outline in that write-up. So thank you guys for listening to my spiel, and sorry for the mic problems at the beginning.
All right, and just a couple of quick notes as we wrap up. Darius asked me to mention a couple of the key takeaways from this evening. Some of the highlights for me, Laura said it loud and clear: stop wasting food. Such a simple thing for us to do. We heard a lot about keeping it local. Whether it's the supply chain of food and where we get our meals from, or whether it's carbon credits and offsets. Something else we heard is that resilience really is multifaceted. It's environmental, it's economic, it's the whole community. It's not just one particular thing. I heard very clearly from Trey that investing in local farmers is really investing in the regional economy. If the farmers are winning, we're all winning, and that's an easy investment for us to make. And I feel like we heard it from every single one of our speakers this evening, and we heard it in a number of the comments as well. It's all about the kids, just like Wu-Tang, we're all for the children. So I think that this is a really, really exciting presentation from the three of our speakers this evening. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Trey. Thank you, Laura. Thank you again to our sponsors at the Roush Foundation for making this all possible. We will see everybody again in 3 weeks for workshop number 3. That's February 23rd. Not workshop number 2, but workshop number 3, Natural Solutions to Protect Our Communities. So we'll be talking in much more detail about the role that environmental protection and what open spaces can do to protect us from the impacts of climate change. It's going to be awesome. We'll have some great speakers. And as always, we look forward to a lot of engaged conversation with the participants here. Thank you, everybody, for giving us a couple hours of your Tuesday evening, and we'll see you next time.